Hello and welcome to Low Carb Conversations. I'm your host, Leah Williamson, and I'm with my host, Holly Jean. Welcome, Holly.
Hi, hello.
We have an amazing guest today. Our guest is a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified diabetes educator, Lily Nichols. Welcome to the podcast, Lily.
Thanks for having me.
Lily, you're the author of two amazing books, Real Food for Pregnancy and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I've been wanting, like I just mentioned off air, I've been wanting to interview you now for quite a few years. I'm really excited to have this chat today. I think it's something that we're not really talking a lot about. And I think that the more awareness that we have around it, it's just going to be, it helps so many more people with their nutrition for prenatal nutrition and things like that. So I'm really excited to talk about this today. And I just would really love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in prenatal nutrition and how you've become such an advocate for it.
Yeah, so I've actually spent most of my career as a dietitian in the prenatal space in one way, shape, or form. So from clinical practice, I've worked with perinatologists and sort of general pregnancy nutrition. I've worked in public policy with the state of California's diabetes and pregnancy program. I've worked in a lot of different sort of research and consulting capacities in the space. So a lot of researchers come to me and ask me for advice on their study designs in regards to things like low carb and pregnancy, which I know we're going to get into today. And I also, in addition to seeing clients for many years, also help train practitioners in prenatal nutrition and nutrition for gestational diabetes. So it's like once I got going in this field, I just kept wanting to continue in it because it's really such a unique time in a woman's life where you're not only impacting your health and your experience of pregnancy, but you're also impacting your baby's development, which can have lifelong consequences for their health as well. With regards specifically to blood sugar issues, if blood sugar is poorly controlled in pregnancy, that child can face anywhere from a 6 to 19-fold increased risk of type 2 diabetes or obesity during their life. And so if we can make a dent in that and reduce, elevated blood sugar in pregnancy, really incorporate more micronutrient dense foods, we can really change the next generation in terms of their health trajectory. Obviously, we're not doing so hot in the US right now. 48 to 49 to 52% of US adults have some form of diabetes. Many cases, it's actually undiagnosed. Only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. I mean, it's just, we're in kind of a disastrous state. So if we can go all the way back to preconception and pregnancy nutrition, we can probably make a bigger dent in those statistics than just trying to target it when they're already adults.
I love that because like you're saying, so often we're looking at everything from I'm already an adult now and I'm already have these metabolic diseases starting to happen or inflammation or whatever the precursors, or I'm already in it. So now I'm going to do something about it. But taking that step back and looking right back at that prenatal nutrition, or even before you're thinking about conceiving,
right,
getting ready. I think that's just, such a great place to start. And you're a mother yourself, so you've experienced it firsthand.
Yeah, you'll probably hear them in the background. So I have a 5-year-old and almost 2-year-old. So yeah, they'll probably be making noise. In fact, I can hear them right now.
There you go.
So certainly that does color your experience as well, because it's you can kind of feel in your own system, man, if I was from just eating well one day to maybe not eating so well other days. I mean, I'm human too. Not every day is picture perfect nutritionally. You can feel the difference in your energy levels. You can see the difference in how much swelling you have. You notice, and certainly the, motherhood transition and postpartum nutrient repletion and nursing, that also just goes to show how important keeping yourself nourished during this whole phase of life is.
Yeah. And I'd really love to know how you became interested in real food nutrition specifically, because that's not the usual path that we know dietitians, and I shouldn't generalize so much, but it's not the usual, like usually you're looking at the standard American diet and you're promoting that, which is a lot different to what you're promoting. So how did you get into that?
Well, you can generalize because dietetics training is standardized, so most of us get pretty similar kind of, we're taught the government guidelines, and our textbooks are, written from a certain angle of viewing nutrition, so to speak. So I actually got exposed to like real food ancestral style nutrition before I went to university. And at the time I was vegetarian, eating a very high carb diet, I'm sure. And I was introduced via a nutritionist in our community to the work of Weston Price, and was kind of introduced to the idea that like, well, there are some important nutrients in animal foods and some people don't do well on a vegetarian diet, and started reading the work of Weston Price and Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon. And that was like my first introduction into it. But I really used my time in college to look into some of the claims from the people in the ancestral nutrition space, because it was like, is that just another fad, like more hearsay, or is there actually evidence to back that? So it was like looking into the importance of fat soluble vitamins, looking into all these different micronutrients in, different forms, the difference between, preformed vitamin A and beta carotene. Like that's something that wasn't really emphasized in my training, looking into sort of traditional preparation of foods. And then later over time, it just naturally by working in the gestational diabetes space after I was already a dietitian, that kind of naturally led me more to the low carb space and understanding, because ancestral nutrition isn't necessarily low carb, but it's generally lower carb than a standard American 45 to 65% of calories from carbs diet, right? But certainly working with people with blood sugar issues made it very clear and made me very curious also about my own, blood sugar response to different foods, and, sort of unwinding a lifetime of living with reactive hypoglycemia and realizing that was just underconsumption of protein, overconsumption of carbs, basically. That pretty much can fix itself within days. So yeah, I was kind of introduced to it early, and then it's just kind of been a matter of like both looking at the research, the clinical experience, and then real life experience, like experimenting with different types of eating for myself that have led me to this place.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad that you were so open about it as well, because a lot of people just are focused so much on what they're studying and aren't open to exploring different ideas. So I guess the whole community is very thankful that you've were open to make that decision to change there.
Yeah.
So then you were seeing lots of clients, I assume, and then you've decided to put together a book. Let's talk about what kind of drew you to putting the book together, and then a little bit about the books.
Sure. Yeah. So my first book is Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I released that in 2015. That was after many years of work at the public policy level and clinical practice, where I was actually putting into practice the guidelines that ironically I had helped work on and seeing how they performed in real life. And you can have your own reservations about things, but until you actually see it in real life in people's blood sugar readings, before and after meals, and like the response of, I'm really too full to eat XYZ, or I don't feel good, or it was all of those experiences that I was like, we're putting at least half of our clients on medication or insulin. And I had already been low carb at the time. So I'm like, man, a minimum of 175 grams of carbohydrates per day seems like a lot, but I mean, I'm not pregnant. And, everybody who's worked on these guidelines said that was necessary. So let me look into this a little deeper, let me see like who originally set these guidelines, because nobody could tell me, where did that number come from? Are we going to meet all the micronutrient requirements of pregnancy? If you go lower in that, what are the risks and trade-offs? And it was in that work that I ended up developing what you find in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, which is just a lower carb, low glycemic, nutrient dense prenatal diet, far exceeds the micronutrient intake that you would get from a conventional prenatal diet, but more importantly, better controls blood sugar. And we have quite a few studies looking at the very least, low glycemic index diets in pregnancy, showing that they can reduce daytime glucose variability by about 50% and also result in 50% lower risk of requiring medication or insulin. And that's what we saw in practice, was that we just didn't need as much medication if we were treating women with carbohydrate intolerance with a diet that provided an appropriate, not excessive level of carbohydrates for their own individual tolerance. I mean, it doesn't seem like rocket science, but it was fairly revolutionary at the time for practice. So that was real food for gestational diabetes. Shortly after that, I began getting questions for, well, what do you do for general prenatal nutrition? What do you recommend for that? And at a certain point, you can't recommend a book that's focused all on blood sugar to people who don't have any blood sugar issues. They just don't, doesn't really jive. So I had my first child after kind of recovering postpartum, about 10 months out. I was like, okay, I'm going to work on this next book. I thought it would be a breeze to write. I thought it would be pretty short. I would just keep it, nice and simple. But the types of questions I got and all of the many, many misconceptions and myths about prenatal nutrition, it kind of turned into a bigger project than I had intended. Definitely a very research heavy resource. It's like over 930 citations that really kind of goes point by point, debunking a lot of different myths on prenatal nutrition, but also giving you the evidence behind certain practices, like why you want to eat certain nutrient dense foods, why the macronutrient recommendations are just frankly wrong, and you have wiggle room to play around with them for your own, however that works for you, looking into supplements, the effects of toxins, looking at exercise in pregnancy, postpartum recovery, breastfeeding nutrition, nutrient transfer into breast milk. It kind of went down like a whole bunch of other rabbit holes beyond just like the focus on blood sugar, which was really like the point of that first book, was to just, for all the women who get diagnosed with gestational diabetes and are freaking out, to just talk them off the ledge and give them the evidence and reassurance that, yes, you can do this, and you can also do it differently than the, whatever meal plan you got from your hospital nutrition class, like, let me empower you with the information to manage this more effectively.
Yeah. Well, that's so great. Such great books that are used, I know, by so many people now as such a great reference and resource. And I'll link those up into the show notes for people if they're wanting to explore them a little more. And we're going to start talking now a little bit, like looking a little bit more into the low carb diet and pregnancy. So Holly's got the first article.
Yeah. And before we do that, I just want to say I did buy that your real food pregnancy book when it came out, and I wasn't pregnant at the time, but I always like to share what book I'm reading. So that fueled a lot of questions when I posted what I was reading. But I wanted to be able to have a guide to offer my clients also to be able to efficiently coach them during their childbearing years and before and after conceiving. Because I know now, like for women going to the doctor asking, or just telling your doctor, look, I'm interested in starting to get pregnant. Is there anything I should change dietarily? Pretty much across the board, doctors just say, yeah, no, it doesn't matter. Like maybe if you have trouble, then come back and we'll revisit that. And so your book is something that I always include in like all my new mommy packs. So every time a friend announces their pregnancy, that book goes in the mail right away.
Thank you.
Whether or not people read them, because it's still like so different from the what to expect when you're expecting type of thing. But I just think there's so much great information in that book. So yes, we will link that up, but you touched on it a little bit. And I know you like doing some myth busting. So before we get into this first article, can you tell us a little bit about what the current macronutrient guidelines are during pregnancy? I think you mentioned the high carb count, but can you touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So the, macronutrients would be your fat, carbohydrates, and protein. So for carbohydrates, they recommend 45 to 65% of your diet from carbs. Or if you're going to start getting in the territory of low carb, they don't dare you go lower than 175 grams per day. For fat, they're typically recommending in like, the 30 to 35% of your diet from fat, and then the remainder coming from protein, which, you can look at different ways, right? You can look at percentage of calories, or you can look at like a gram amount per body weight. And interestingly, a 2015 study was the first ever to directly measure protein requirements in pregnant women. And they found that those like gram-based recommendations were a significant underestimate of protein requirements. So like, oops, we messed up. Actually, in late pregnancy, you need 73% more protein than we previously thought. So just to give you like, some like background on, these really are guesstimates that are based off of the, standard adult dietary guidelines. And they're really just adjusted via mathematical estimate and assumed to be appropriate for pregnancy, even if we don't have a whole lot of hardcore data saying, yes, for sure, this is correct.
I feel like that's pretty commonplace when it comes to any recommendations for pregnancy. It's just our best guess. There really aren't a lot of studies. And maybe, I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just considered not safe to do studies with pregnant women, or what. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, I honestly don't know.
Well, yeah. So on some level, there's ethical concerns. Certainly studies where you are maybe restricting nutrients to what might be considered deficient levels. That would be unethical, because what happens to those babies, right? Sometimes when we know there's like a safety margin for a certain nutrient, choline is a great example. There's some good randomized controlled trials now where they provided like just above the RDA, or it's actually a recommended intake, but nonetheless, a recommended intake for choline. And then the other group got like more than double that amount. So it's like, well, we know more is safe, but we're not going to have the control group be deficient. And interestingly, that study found like, oh, wow, the babies of the high choline group outperformed on cognitive tests in infancy and childhood. Maybe where we set the choline recommended intake was incorrect, right? So
wow,
there's a lot of guesstimates. There's a lot of extrapolating from animal models, or extrapolating from estimates of nutrient requirements from studies in men, adjusting via body weight for women, and then looking at, usually via calculations, it depends, but like maybe fetal accrual of a nutrient. So if there have been situations of like stillborn babies, they might, like for vitamin A, that's how part of how they figured out the vitamin A requirements, is they actually looked at liver stores in stillborn babies in their liver, like vitamin A stores in the livers of stillborn babies, which is interesting because like, well, how do we know those babies were healthy if they were stillborn? But nonetheless, they'll sometimes use markers like that, but they try not to do anything that could put mother or baby in harm's way for, again, obvious ethical reasons. So it just sort of leaves us with difficulty in estimating these. Like the study on protein requirements of 2015 that was using like a new method for estimating protein requirements that is non-invasive via like a secondary marker. So they don't need to like cut into you or deprive you of protein and watch for the results. Like they can do it via a secondary method. So yeah, it's a bit of an interesting and certainly a challenging field to be in, because there are still so many unknowns. And I personally think there's a lot of room to kind of sort of prod and question, well, how was that guideline set? Is it really that strong of data for this particular intake level? Is there wiggle room? Which is why for me, I end up kind of reverse engineering a prenatal diet on something that I feel like, okay, like this is something that people can eat. It would be filling. You'd be providing a lot of micronutrient dense foods. Let's just sort of see where we end up with the macros if we're starting with a diet that's like micronutrient sufficient. So that's kind of the approach that I take. And until we, have more and better data, perhaps I'll adjust that in the future. But that, I feel like that is a more evidence-based way to go about prenatal nutrition than just sort of guesstimating, like we have this data from the 1950s and
Right.
we don't have enough data to question it, so we'll just leave it the same. It's like, okay, turns out vitamin B12 requirements are triple what we thought they were. Okay, so yeah.
Well, now we know. Let's stop comparing us to men because we're apples and oranges. Okay, so this first article here, it's exploring low carb diets during pregnancy. Just a summary for those of you, our listeners who don't have the article in front of you. It says the keto diet, which is a high fat, low carbohydrate, is popular among both men and women. And the keto diets are attractive because they can result in significant fast weight loss, but there are some health concerns associated, and most important being the lack of the good sugars in the diet. The body requires sugar from glucose and other carb sources to produce ATP, which is the main energy transporting molecule in your body. And although low carb diets during pregnancy are thought to be associated with lower maternal weight gain, there are some risks. I know this is a topic that you talk to a lot about in your first book. What are some of the potential risks of a low carbohydrate diet, if anything? What are your thoughts on this, Lily?
Well, first of all, I'd probably have to take like a closer intake at what they actually meant by low carb, because a lot of times these studies that say they're low carb are not low carb.
Yeah,
So I'll try to pull this up
study
here. I pulled up the study and I was able to open the
Okay, good.
data here. So I don't know if they'll tell me via, they don't have a chart that shows the exact macronutrient breakdown, unfortunately. So I'd have to sort of dig through it a little more. But nonetheless, just from a general stance, some of the concerns in a low carb diet would be like, what is actually making up the diet? Like, is the person eating low carb via eating, meat and fish and nuts and seeds and eggs and lower carbohydrate dairy products and berries and leafy greens and chia seeds and avocado and olives? Or is the person eating low carb via eating like low carb convenience foods, like some low carb nutrition bar, and then going out for chicken wings with like bad quality ranch dressing and having like Cool Whip for dinner on top of, keto ice cream? Like,
Right.
it's not just macros that matter, obviously, like diet quality matters. So I'd have to take a closer look and see like, what do they actually eat? There are some nutrients that you want to be like more cautious about when you're low carb, again, depending on the makeup of the diet. So one nutrient that comes to mind would be folate. Are you getting enough folate? Technically, you can get folate in a lot of low carb foods. However, if you're not eating leafy greens and you're not eating liver, for example, which are two of the, very best sources of folate, and then that only leaves, for significant sources like beans and legumes, which you might not be eating, then yeah, you could run into like a folate deficiency issue, which has carryover side effects. What were the types of fat they were eating? Are they eating mostly like high omega-6 vegetable oils? Trans fats, there's like a study in rats that people talk about where they gave them a ketogenic diet and said, there were poor outcomes. And I looked at the study. I even emailed the manufacturers of the ketogenic rat feed. And first of all, the diet was, as percent energy, 90% fat, leaving automatic protein deficiency. Okay. But second of all, that 90% of the diet that came from fat was literally Crisco.
Oh my
I'm
gosh.
not kidding you. It was literally Crisco. So if you, and a lot of times when they formulate these rat chows, they're also not like putting in requisite micronutrients as well. So sometimes they'll cut down on the normal rat chow and then feed like the other 50% of their diet pure Crisco or like pure whatever fat. It doesn't even matter if it's a good quality fat, you're going to be micronutrient
Right.
and create problems, right? So a lot of times when I'm looking at these things, I'm like, well, what do you actually mean by ketogenic? So sometimes these studies are not actually low carb. They're like 40% calories from carbohydrates, which is really not low carb. They're poor quality sources of fat. They're, protein deficient or micronutrient deficient. And any and all of those things will create adverse outcomes. So if you're going to venture low carb, just like if you're going to eat, a non-low carb diet, you want to be cognizant of getting enough of your micronutrients, because many of them play really, really important roles in fetal development. And there are periods of development where, for example, like the brain is developing or the skeleton is developing, where this is like an irreversible period of development. You can't like rewind the clock 3 months and change anything, or you can't, provide a supplement of vitamin B12, for example, when you were deficient like 4 months in the future, and undo the detriments to brain development during those previous months when you were nutrient deficient. It's just like it's kind of like puberty. You can't like reverse it. It's like we need specific nutrients at specific times. So I think no matter what, it has to be done intelligently. And a lot of times I see these study designs and I'm like, what were they thinking? Of course you didn't get great outcomes.
Right. And I think that's why it's so important that we have these conversations like this, because these are the articles that people are reading. Like these are what's popping up in your MSM or your news feed when you're logging into your email. And really it's just kind of like the headline, it's clickbait, but for someone who doesn't know any better would look at this article and think, oh gosh, well, I shouldn't do that. Even if even someone who's maybe currently low carb and feeling great, maybe a study or an article like this based on studies that may not be the best, but they might change things up just based off an article. You mentioned nutrient importance, and this isn't in the article, but I feel like there's a lot of emphasis put on like taking a prenatal vitamin, or maybe a false sense of security for a lot of women who are pregnant, just thinking, oh, well, I take my prenatal. Are prenatal vitamins, like, are they enough to fill the gap where deficiencies might be for someone who's not eating the best diet? I mean, I know that's very bio individual, but just like in general.
It depends on the prenatal.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. As I was asking that, I was thinking, I was like, well, I guess it depends on the brand and everything.
Yeah. So there's huge variation. I mean, people are really surprised that there's not like, an FDA standard to meet certain targets of certain nutrients to qualify as a prenatal vitamin. Any company can just call it a prenatal, whether it's a good quality one or a not good quality one. I mean, there are some on the market that intentionally keep key nutrients out of it. Like it's not a comprehensive prenatal vitamin. They're just like, oh, we're choosing the ones that are most likely to deficient, which like when I look at what they chose, it was like they're just pulling things out of a hat. It's completely random what's actually in there. And oh, these other ones, like women get enough of those, so we're not putting those in the supplement, and here you go. And it's highly marketed, tons of influencer marketing for this particular brand, and it's garbage, so a lot of it really depends. Like half of the prenatal vitamins on the market don't include iodine, which is a really key nutrient for thyroid health and infant brain development. A lot of prenatal vitamins don't contain choline, or if they do, they contain it in like pixie dust amounts. That's also really vital to fetal brain development. And if you're not a pretty big consumer of eggs or liver, and then like tertiary to that, pretty much your animal foods are your next best sources, it's pretty likely you're going to be among the 94% of women who's not consuming enough choline, so it's tricky to say. It really depends on which one. How comprehensive is the formula? Sometimes even looking at like the capsule count can help give you sort of a guesstimate of that. If it's a 1-a-day prenatal, you're going to be missing out. It's just impossible from like just a physical perspective of fitting the nutrients into the capsule in sufficient quantities. You're not going to get there with anything less than like a 3-a-day formula. So
interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a good tip. Let's go back to the low carb diets. Now, maybe this article is saying that there are some risks, but there are also some benefits. And I think this actually ties in nicely to our next article, which Leah's going to talk more about gestational diabetes. But do you want to just maybe summarize who would benefit from a low carb diet during pregnancy? And then we can transition into gestational diabetes.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, a well-formulated low carb diet, preferably one that's like containing a fair amount of whole food, unprocessed foods, what I call real food, will meet your micronutrient needs quite well, help you meet those higher protein targets that we now know are a legitimate thing, and also better manage your blood sugar. So when they provide, lower carb or low glycemic diets in pregnancy, significantly reduces your blood sugar variation during the day, which is, I mean, pretty obvious for anyone who's eaten low carb, regardless of whether you're pregnant or not. If you've ever monitored your blood sugar or worn a continuous glucose monitor, you can see very clearly that carbohydrate foods are the ones that have the biggest impact on your blood sugar levels. And especially when you eat carbohydrates alone or in a processed form or in excessive quantities, you'll get a bigger blood sugar spike. And we know that just having elevated blood sugar is linked to all sorts of problems with fetal development of varying severity depending on what time point in pregnancy it is happening. So in early pregnancy, that can be linked to a higher risk of certain birth defects, for example, because the developing embryo is very, very sensitive to blood sugar fluctuations. And then in later pregnancy can be associated with the baby growing too large because you're spiking the baby's insulin levels, and thus the baby puts on more weight. It can impair lung development. It can also influence, the development of their pancreas, and that's the, factor that can really impact their lifetime risk of diabetes, right? But a lot of these things do not happen if we just keep blood sugar levels within, the tightly controlled range that they prefer to be. So if you just, titrate your carbs down a little bit, it doesn't even have to be excessive. I actually don't push for what most people think of as a ketogenic diet. It's more of like a moderately low carb diet where your carb sources are primarily like vegetables, nuts and seeds, if you tolerate them well, beans, low carb dairy products, lower sugar fruit. If you get most of your carbs from those sources and not so much of them from your starchy foods and your grains, especially your refined grains and your sugars, like you're good. You're in a really good place for optimizing your nutrient intake. We know that, for example, micronutrient intake has an inverse relationship with refined carbohydrate intake, which is obvious, right? Because your refined carbs are white flour, white rice, refined grains, refined sugars. Like they just don't have almost any other nutrients other than their pure sugar or starch in there. So what are they doing? They're just displacing other things from the diet, which would otherwise be giving you all those vitamins and minerals and antioxidants and things that you actually need.
Yeah, I feel like we could learn so much just by having women during pregnancy wear one of those CGM devices, the continual glucose monitors. Like, I would like to see that study.
They're starting to do more of them, actually.
Are they?
Yeah. And
Good.
I wore a CGM during my second pregnancy. I didn't have it available my first pregnancy, but they were more widely available at that time. So I wore ones several times to keep an eye on things, see what my blood sugar spikes were like, see what my averages were like. And there are studies looking at CGM use in pregnancy. There can be some CGMs they're not perfect, right? Because it's interstitial fluid instead of reading a blood glucose reading. But and in pregnancy, it can be a little tricky because like you have more fluids in your body. So there have interestingly been questions about accuracy. Although when I did it, I verified with a finger stick and they were only like 5 to maybe 10 points different. So in terms of actually getting a trend on my blood sugar response, CGM was like perfect. If you need to double check to see that the number is exactly on point or not, you can do a finger stick and see that you're in the ballpark or whatever. But the studies they've done on gestational diabetes so far show that it does improve outcomes, because instead of just testing randomly at 1 or 2 hours after a meal, where you don't know if you spiked at 45 minutes and are coming down. Are you still in the process of spiking? Have you been like leveled off for about 20 minutes and are about to drop down? Like, you have no idea. You're just taking it at this random time point. So you don't know what your spike was like. You know, sometimes if you're eating something that's lower carb, you might not spike as high, but you might sort of sustain at a moderately higher level. So let's say you have like pasta, you spike to like 160 and then tank down to 70. I'm using US readings, milligrams per deciliter, obviously. But say you have a lower carb meal and you go up to like 110 and then hang out at 110, and then you're like maybe 105 by the time you check. Like, you're still well within target. It's never been a problem, but you could see that reading at 105 and be like, oh no, when I checked this other one, I was at 85. Like, that meal was bad for my blood sugar. When no, it wasn't. You just caught your blood sugar at a different time point. You have no idea what your spike was actually like. So I'm a big fan of CGM if people can get a hold of it, which is tricky since it's, you know, prescription only, and some of them, at least in the US, and some of them they don't like prescribing in pregnancy outside of, you know, situations like type 1 diabetes, but they are becoming more widely available, and I think they will continue to be.
I'm sure we'll have it on our watches or phones in no time in the future years. We'll be able to track that way. I wanted to mention too, sometimes, you know, it's, you know, a lot of our listeners are already on a low carb diet or exploring it or ketogenic diet, and they may be wanting to conceive or may already be. And I just wanted to say also that, you know, sometimes some of these plans you just have to throw out the window as well. Like, you know, in my circumstance, I had 20 weeks of morning and day, you know, morning, night and day sickness. So I was not in a good way. And all I wanted to eat when I was in the middle of being, you know, paleo was everything, and we'd transitioned our whole family. And all I wanted to eat was white bread and Vegemite, which is like yeast extract or whatever we have here. And I put a lot of pressure on myself. I was like, I can't be eating this food, but this is all I can keep down. And I really was such pressure on myself to be like, why am I doing this? And I read a really great, I don't even think it was an article. I think it was just like a question to Mark Sisson. Someone had asked the question, like, what can I do? Like, I'm not paleo anymore because, you know, this is all happening. He's just like, just take a step back, take a breath, you know, in Mark's kind of way. And he said, just paleofy what you're eating. And then I was like, I like that thought. And I hadn't really thought about it. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to try adding an egg to this combination.
Right.
So I wanted to say, sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect during this time as well. But sometimes our body is just saying other things to us. Yeah.
And actually there's a lot of women who just naturally crave more carbs in the first trimester. So this is a good point to bring up, is that we don't have the data on it, but I personally believe that you can tolerate a higher amount of carbohydrates in the first trimester, because your body is absolutely in an anabolic state. And later in pregnancy, you kind of switch to a catabolic state. So when you think about like, what do you want to do for your body to like gain weight and grow tissue? Like, certainly protein's important, always is, but carbohydrates too. Your body wants them for a reason. Your thyroid has ramped up thyroid hormone production by 50%. There's this whole like array of hormonal things going on. And even if you're not eating perfect, which most of us aren't in the first trimester, myself included, for both of my pregnancies as well, you can also kind of rest assured that like Mother Nature has your back too, because it turns out that until the placenta is fully formed, the embryo is actually nourished by the endometrium, the lining of your uterus. And so the endometrium is actually what nourishes that embryo until the placenta takes over, which isn't until close to the end of the first trimester, right? So technically during that time, it's like you are relying on your preconception nutrient stores to keep everything good. And your body does have nutrient stores, and it is by design, it will sacrifice your nutrient stores for baby, you know? So I think we can kind of sort of chill a little bit. We do know insulin sensitivity tends to be higher in the first trimester, like you kind of have this honeymoon period before the insulin resistance of late pregnancy starts. Your electrolyte needs are a lot higher because your blood volume is already increasing even by like 5 weeks of pregnancy. So that explains like the salt and potassium cravings and the chocolate cravings. Certainly things like, one of the things on really bad days for me was salt and vinegar chips. So they were like crunchy, salty, sour. But when I think back to it, I'm like, well, they also are like high potassium, high sodium. Of course my body wanted it. Like it just wanted the electrolytes, right? So definitely, you know, give yourself a pat on the back. I do have a blog post on my site called First Trimester Tips with a video and also a lot of written stuff describing, you know, how to get through that phase and just sort of normalizing the experience of that, like queasiness, morning sickness, fatigue, blab, bloating, puffy sort of, it's all for a good reason and it's all totally normal. And it, you know, it usually is a phase. Some people do unfortunately have that like long lasting nausea for their whole pregnancy, but for a lot of people, it does ease up sometime, usually by like the second trimester or midway in pregnancy.
Yeah. And then you have that great second trimester and then the third hits and you're like, all right, I'm done with this.
100%. Yep.
I'm not the best advocate for being pregnant, I'd say, because I'm always like, yeah, just get it done and get it over with. Just don't go back for more.
It's tiring. It's a lot on your body. That's why I'm such an advocate for all the postpartum recovery stuff. It's like, you want to enter into this, you know, solid nutritionally, because you can't predict how your body is going to respond.
That's right. Well, coming back to gestational diabetes, I just wanted to draw just a couple of points out of this article. So it even starts off with saying, according to this article, it's like 6 to 9% of expecting Americans have gestational diabetes. And then the article asks if this is a cause for sleepless panic. Not really, not quite. And I was just wondering what you thought about that, because like to me, it seems like any kind of statistic around gestational diabetes is a bit of a concern, but they're kind of like, yeah, it's not that bad.
Yeah. And that's interesting numbers they threw in there. So it depends on like what study you're pulling from, where you get your stats. So current stats, and some of it depends on what diagnostic criteria are used, but it's more like 18% of pregnancies. And I even saw a study out of Europe where it was 22% of pregnancies. So gestational diabetes is by far the most common pregnancy complication. And it is essentially carbohydrate intolerance of pregnancy, meaning your blood sugar is higher than we'd expect after a carbohydrate load. Whether that is, you know, something that developed as a result of pregnancy, or whether that was something you entered into pregnancy with, and we've just checked for it now, it's just elevated blood sugar in pregnancy. And I don't think we need to have like cause for alarm and people be scared, but I do think we need more awareness around the importance of blood sugar management in pregnancy. It is something that is so much more in your control than people think. You can make dramatic changes in your average blood sugar levels or your, you know, blood sugar responses to meals just by shifting your food intake or the timing of what you're eating or your sleep or your micronutrient intake. A lot of them play a role in how your body responds to your insulin and such. So I don't know that it would be like, oh, it's no big deal. Like, it's kind of a big deal. We don't need to be scared, but we do need to be proactive about it, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. And then we've already talked about diet, but their recommendations were to have 3 regular well-spaced meals, 4 to 6 hours apart, with a small snack between each meal and in the evening. And it said a balanced diet that includes carbohydrates, proteins, and fats is preferred, but it doesn't really go into much more detail than that, except for to say that they like choose whole wheat breads, pasta, brown rice, and starchy vegetables such as corn. So that was the recommendations for gestational. Yeah. So, but there's still a lot of that around, isn't there? There's
a lot of it around. I mean, and I see it all the time. You know, I have an online course for gestational diabetes, and the women in it will share, they're like, oh, I went to the hospital nutrition class and here's what I got. And then you hear the other ones chime in with like, oh, and I got this one, and oh, look at this one. It's just, yeah, you know, my blood sugar readings were terrible. I followed it for 3 days until I found you and started doing different. Now all my numbers are perfect. You know, if you're providing women with carbohydrate loads that they can't handle, you're just there on a, you know, speed train to requiring insulin, when insulin is an amazing tool and we need it in certain situations for sure, but it shouldn't be 50% of pregnancies with gestational diabetes. Or in some endocrinology practices, I've had women say, oh yeah, my endo says that 90% of their patients with GD require insulin. I'm like, well, that means that whatever you're recommending is obviously a mismatch for the diagnosis. It's carbohydrate intolerance of pregnancy. We diagnose it via a glucose tolerance test. So let's see how your body handles this large bolus of glucose, which can range anywhere from like 50 grams to 100 grams. Oh, you failed. Okay, you have gestational diabetes. Here's your meal plan that has like 50 grams or 75 grams of carbohydrates per meal. Like, what are we expecting?
Yeah.
They couldn't handle a glucose load of that amount and maintain normal blood sugar levels. Why are you giving them a meal plan with that amount of carbohydrate and expecting that somehow magically, because it's in the form of complex carbohydrates, all is going to be fine? I mean, it doesn't make sense. I mean, oftentimes we just need to like cut those meal plans in half in terms of their carbs, double the protein, keep them, you know, don't make them fear fat, allow them to eat a sufficient amount of salt, which also improves their insulin sensitivity and improves their electrolyte intake. And like, lo and behold, this 90% of people requiring insulin is like 10 or 20%, you know?
And it can be managed. Yeah.
I know. I mean, it's just, it doesn't seem that hard, but it is, you know, it remains to be controversial. For better, for worse, you know, the Czech Republic actually revised their gestational diabetes guidelines back in 2016. One of the top, they call them diabetologists in their country, got a hold of Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. She works with a lot of gestational diabetes in practice, and she was able to actually push for policy reform. So now, instead of having their minimum carb intake was actually 200 grams per day, now that's set as the maximum. And they're, once again, it's like rates of requiring insulin or medication like slashed in half now.
That's amazing.
So, you know, and again, we're not talking people limiting their carbs to like 20 grams a day or something. You can still enjoy an array of plant foods. You don't have to be so strict that you're to the point of counting carbs from kale or almonds or something. You know what I mean? It's just like, let's replace all of the refined grain foods with like vegetables and stuff. Let's give you a sufficient amount of protein so you can actually be full, actually get a sufficient amount of calories and protein to fill you up. Let's not fear fat. And a lot of these problems that seem so perplexing for some reason fix themselves. I mean, it doesn't have to be hard. I mean, that's the kind of the good news and the bad news is like, it's just kind of sad that we're still at this place where women are getting such bad advice. That's again a mismatch for their diagnosis.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, Holly, do you have anything else you want to add to this?
No, just this whole conversation, I've been wondering, like, you touched on a little bit like the actual testing for gestational diabetes. And it's like, it's an hour after you eat something, but what if you spike later? And I've always had like a sneaking suspicion that I had undiagnosed gestational diabetes with my second son. And so it just, you know, my mind's just kind of reeling right now. And like, I'm wondering if someone has gestational diabetes, it's like, what does that say about their metabolic health when they're not pregnant? Like, do people who are metabolically healthy get GD? Just so many questions. That's probably just too many to answer right now on this little podcast.
I actually think I can answer that fairly succinctly. So gestational diabetes is the strongest independent risk factor in women for later development of type 2 diabetes, which often develops within 5 to 10 years post having your baby. in a pregnancy that was complicated with GD. So it is huge. To me, it's like the warning light coming on in your car. Pregnancy is a stress test on your body. All of your organ systems and your circulatory system and your endocrine system, all these things have to adapt on a massive scale to accommodate growth of the baby. And a lot of those accommodations are like somewhat of a diabetic state, in that like your response to insulin is impaired, your production of insulin is high, like you're naturally in this sort of insulin resistant pre-diabetic state. Yet if the body adapts as designed, you don't have high blood sugar actually. So that's kind of the interesting part. Your blood sugar actually, if everything goes as planned, trends about 20% lower than outside of pregnancy. When that doesn't happen, if there's sort of pre-existing, pre-diabetes issues, or maybe for some reason your body just doesn't adapt well, that's when we have this, what we would call gestational diabetes happening. And so, I don't think it's fate or destiny that everyone is, they call it converting into type 2 diabetes. I don't think it's destiny that everybody's going to convert into type 2 diabetes. My kids are really loud, apologies. But there is, a higher risk factor. Anywhere from like 30 to 70% will, develop it later on. With that one caveat though, I do want to say that the diagnostic criteria for gestational diabetes are really tricky for people who are metabolically healthy and eating low carb. Some of those women will get a false positive on a glucose tolerance test because your pancreas temporarily, it adapts to eating low carb. You don't pump out big boluses of insulin because it doesn't need to. So when it randomly sees a 50 to 100 gram load of pure sugar, your pancreas is almost like slower to kick in. Does that make sense? So you might actually spike a little higher. And they've known this since like the 1960s, by the way, that if you deprive people of carbohydrates for a period of time, they'll fail a glucose tolerance test. If you carb load them for a week prior, they will pass if they're metabolically healthy, right? And they abandoned the advice to carb load prior to a glucose tolerance test. I think it was sometime in the 90s, because this was like, 15, 20 years after the high carb dietary guidelines. Everybody was already eating a ton of bread and sugar and all this other stuff. You don't need to carb load before a glucose tolerance test if you're already eating that way. But if you're eating very low carb, you might see a higher than normal response to a glucose tolerance test. And so in that case, there can be false positives where I don't think you're at a higher risk for type 2 diabetes later on if you had like a random high on your glucose tolerance test, but when you're testing your blood sugar at home, they're like perfect. And actually I did have that scenario, just so you know, and I did write about it on my blog for people who want to read it. It was like, I failed. If you look up, I failed the glucola on my blog, you'll find it was a 2-part series that I did in my first pregnancy. And so I did the 50 gram test. I quote failed by a point. All my blood sugars were great at home. I declined the 3-hour test because I didn't want 100 gram load of glucose. Right. Everything was fine. Healthy pregnancy, definitely no gestational diabetes. I've done a ton of advanced lab work looking at glucose, my like HOMA insulin resistance, markers, adiponectin and leptin, and like all these different things. They're all perfect. I've worn CGM many times. It's very clearly not diabetic. Definitely not gestational diabetic in my next pregnancy. And I just home monitored for my next pregnancy instead of doing a glucose tolerance test. But if I were ever to opt for a glucose tolerance test, and it was like, you want to make sure it's actually, quote, accurate, you're adapted to a high carb diet, I would definitely be eating, at least 150 grams of carbs for about a week leading into the test to avoid a false positive.
That's good advice.
Well, I think we're just about at the end of the show. You've been such a great guest to have on, given us so much information, Lily. I've just like been writing lots of notes down at the same time on the side there, just so much great information. And We'll link up in the show notes some of those blog posts and things that you've mentioned. Is there anything coming up in the horizon for you, or anything that you want to mention to our listeners, or where they can find you even?
Sure. Yeah. So you can find me at lilynicholsrdn.com. On my site, I have lots of different freebies that may be of interest depending on what you're interested in. So there's like a free video series on gestational diabetes, if that's of interest, that I give away the first chapter of Real Food for Pregnancy for free over there. My blog has a ton of free information, so definitely use the search bar or just look through some of my past articles. I teach professional level webinars at the Women's Health Nutrition Academy. That's also linked out from my site. And you can find the links to my books and where to purchase those on my site as well. And then as far as social media, you can find me mostly on Instagram, although I can't say I'm like the most active gung-ho Instagrammer. And my handle's the same as my website. So it's Lily Nichols RDN.
Great. Well, so great chatting to you. Thanks so much. And
yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Well, that's the end of today's episode. Our theme music is created by Andrew Bowden, and production services are by Kevin Kennedy Spain of Disc of Light Media. Have a great week, everyone.
Have a great week.